Style has many different definitions. Some encapsulate something novel about the visual appearance of a subject, while others describe a way of doing something in a distinct manner. But for whatever your definition is, when you look at something, it tends to give you a feeling of, yeah, that's got style. Or you might have the opposite of this feeling and knowing that something does not. But from time to time, something comes along that gives you the impression that you aren't dealing with the average definition of style anymore. Spider-Verse, on the other hand, broke so much new ground it left the team working on it feeling like they were working on multiple films at once.
Do you hear that? It's the winds of change.
But why change the format now? Pixar had worked pretty hard to innovate and perfect their 3D style, which a lot of people come to expect when watching an animated film. Years of working on Pixar films brought new technology and new ways of doing things for each new film that they launched. Increased character count, better textures, more realistic lighting, more dynamic character animations, and complex reflections. And pretty much each new film that Pixar launched pushed the overall style forward for a sense of realism. And comparing their latest film to their first one, the difference is pretty monumental. But Spider-Verse is a soft rejection of this realism style and very much playing its own game.
I'm gonna do my own thing.
Today we're diving behind the creative direction of these films, what makes them unique, styles you might have missed and where they might have come from. Welcome to episode 2 within this series, exploring the genius behind the Spider-Verse films. Make sure you check out episode 1 on colour if you get the chance, and you don't need to watch them in any particular order. This episode on style will very much focus on the first Spider-Verse film. Let's jump in. Spider-Verse's style is a smelting pot of 3D animation, pulling aspects of 2D animation, comic book aesthetics, and different types of art style. It's an important note that animation and art styles are not the same thing, and one can very much exist without the other. Spider-Verse changes both of these things in order to create an overall aesthetic for a world or a character. So, within a film with so many different styles, you have to ask yourself, what is universal throughout them all? You do need a bit of an understanding of the basics before we can dive into what makes them unique. So here's a quick rundown of the basics.
What the hell is a rundown?
Spider-Verse uses 3D animation as a base, very similar to a traditional Pixar film, but has an additional 2D layer which brings very much a handcrafted feel. It works very differently in practice than traditional anime or Western cartoons. While many animation studios will have their own unique spin on the 2D animation process, for the most part it can be chunked into a few different sections. After a script is created, along with character designs and reference points to many locations within the film, it then moves over to the storyboarding phase, which everything is broken down into little thumbnails with key details on what should happen within the scene. These then get turned into cool layouts with a lot more detailed artwork and intricacies on how a scene should play out. This then moves into the phase where you create keyframes, which are the main parts of an animation movement, usually the beginning and the end. Then in between animators come in, and like their name suggests, they very much draw each frame in between keyframes in order to make the final movement. Then, if the supervisor's happy and everything has a coherent look, things move into the composition stage. All of these frames then get turned into a soft animatic, which is then ultimately coloured digitally, and then any other additional effects like lens flares or film grain get added on top of all of this. So these are the core chunks of the 2D animation process. The 3D animation process, on the other hand, is slightly different. After the scripting phase is over, it then moves into a concept art stage, creating many different reference points to characters and locations. Some scenes are ultimately turned into really basic animatics as a reference point to animation. The modeling phase then begins, where they create the models of all of the main characters and environments of the film. Anything with nuanced animation is then rigged in order to be controlled like a puppet. You can then start animating your scenes. Once your scene is then built out, all the textures have been applied and the lighting is all set up, your composition stage then begins as you collate all of your frames in order to make a finished scene. While there is a lot more nuance and complexity to both of these two processes, I hope you get an understanding of how differently things are animated. What Spider-Verse tends to do is use 3D animation as a base, but then has an additional 2D layer to make it handcrafted.
At the beginning of the project, I said, I want the audience to be able to stop any frame, and it should look like a piece of artwork.
The reason that you can appreciate each frame in so much detail like this is because of the novel approach of the way the Spider-Verse team worked. There's been very few teams that have successfully captured a lot of the novelty and artistic flavour of 2D concept art and bringing it into a 3D environment. The Spider-Verse team brought a few innovations in terms of technology and workflow as to why they could achieve such a novel look. The overall creative direction of trying to make every frame look like a painting pushed 3D artists and many people involved in lighting and texture to recreate a very novel 2D style. This pushed many of the artists to recreate these environments in painstaking detail to figure out what was possible and what wasn't. By answering some of these questions, it pushed some of the team to create new technology in order to either automate things that would have taken a very long time, or create new sets of ways of doing things entirely. And the final directional choice as to why each frame looks the way it does is the handoff between 2D and 3D. While many creative deliverables were done in 2D like animatics and concept art, when it got to the 3D stage and scenes were rendered after being animated and textured, a 2D artist would go back over some frames and add lots of nuanced detail to make it just a bit more handcrafted. So while there were some overall directional changes to innovate in order to make every frame look the way it does, what were some of the more intricate decisions they made within each area? For its 3D layer, you very much have the normal traditional setup. The scene is rendered in 24 frames a second, which is traditional to most films. But for a character like Miles, they chose to animate him on 2s. So while there would be basically 24 pictures within 1 second, for Miles there are actually only 12.
Come on, give him the chips, let's play. Woo, I'm gonna get some of this money. Oh. Do not. What the hell is that? You a racist?
No, I'm not.
What? How did that happen?
It just happened.
It just happened, didn't it?
Sorry.
Oh, this is just crazy.
Right.
Which leads to a less smooth animation, which very much mirrors the fact that Miles is still trying to be Spider-Man and isn't as experienced as his counterparts. And to make matters even more complicated, some 2D effects are actually done in a 3D manner. The half-toning effects, for instance, were actually a 3D texture applied to many objects that could very much be dialed up and down. And a lot of the expressive line work that you see on characters' faces, while they very much have a 2D appearance and it looks like they could have been drawn on, they were very much a 3D model which had their own rig in order to create expressions that could be turned on and off.
His eyes were built to be irregular in shape, and the highlights of his eyes were often hand-animated to look as though they were blobs of paint.
Some components of traditional 2D animation very much made their way into this film. A very important principle within 2D animation is squash and stretch. It very much makes animation a lot more expressive. Smears, for instance, are very much used in between frames of a key animation, and it can make a motion a lot more expressive. While the object in question might have broken proportions temporarily, it very much adds to the final impact of the motion, and it's very much used in fight scenes, or any scene that you want exaggerated impact. Another version of this technique involves something that is moving to be drawn multiple times at once in order to exaggerate the speed at which something is happening. So for the Tasmanian Devil, drawing multiple hands even on one frame isn't atomically correct because he obviously only has 2 arms, but it makes his spin look a lot more faster. Spider-Verse uses both of these, either breaking the model or adding double of a model at once in order to exaggerate the motion. Or in some cases, creating a double, removing the original and adding a smear. And the last technique, which very much adds to both the 2D and 3D aesthetic, is all the additional line work. This one technique adds so much to the film, and it's used in such a variety of ways. It's used to convey a range of motion, sometimes being added on top of a series of other techniques. It can be used to frame your eye before something's about to happen on screen, and it can be used in a quite subtle manner or something that is so exaggerated it really brings your eye to it. While this technique is pretty subtle and you would need to pause the film to even notice it most of the time, it adds so much to the animation and it adds to the sense of novelty within this film. And a really large part of its novelty is its comic book aesthetic. While nothing to do with 2D or 3D animation, many devices and techniques used to bring comic books to life very much underpin many aspects of this film. Caption boxes are used a lot within comic books, either to show internal monologue for a character or to set the scene. While this mechanism is somewhat redundant within a medium that has audio, the team used it to help enhance some scenes as well as pace parts of the story. An interesting detail is that Miles only starts to see some of these comic book aesthetics once he's bitten by the spider. Another interesting technique that they used were the inclusion of Ben-Day dots. This was very much used to create a sense of texture and also save on printing costs. Ben-Day dots have a uniform size and are spaced evenly between themselves or sometimes overlapping in order to create another colour. These textures are a soft optical illusion and help your brain fill in details that aren't there. And paired with the limitation of printing for older comics at the time, it gave artists a way of creating a lot more shades than they could otherwise normally print. Despite Spider-Verse being an animated film all digital with no limit to how they apply or mix colour, they have used this effect in some areas of the film. Those caption boxes from before, for instance, very much have Ben-Day dots applied to them as an overlay, perhaps to make them feel even more comic booky. A very notable technique from comic books are the sound effects that very much come in the form of onomatopoeias. This lettering technique very much comes in the form of many different styles, and it's used very subtly or in a very bold manner throughout this film. A technique that's used quite a lot in this film is cross-hatching. This very popular illustration technique is used throughout Spider-Verse in basically every frame of the film. This technique has such a heavy and varied use within the film that even if you look at one frame, you might see cross-hatching having different line lengths, overall direction, and differing transparency depending on the object it's applied to. Another popular technique that's paired with cross-hatching is the half-toning effect. While very similar to Ben-Day dots and many others seeming to confuse the two, they are actually quite different. Within a half-tone, the dots are varied in size, whereas in Ben-Day dots they are all consistent. The overall use of half-toning and cross-hatching really helps inform this textured look that makes it very different from a lot of 3D animation. One of the most pleasant inclusions within this film in terms of style is Jack Kirby's famous Kirby Crackle. The legendary artist famously used this technique in many Marvel comic books. This technique was used in a variety of different ways, but at times it was used to convey environments that felt otherworldly or cosmic. By utilizing negative space, it helped convey the idea of magic or energy in a way that can be sometimes hard to draw. And sometimes it was very much just used to build a sense of tension or mystery within a story. While for the most part this technique only really existed in the printed format, it is growing in usage, like in Marvel's What If series, or as a soft homage in some live action films.
Dormammu, I've come to bargain.
I do think the use of it in the Spider-Verse film is probably the best from what I've seen. Its excellent use within the Collider sequences really helps sell the high stakes, and it really helps sell the multiverse theme just a little bit more with how random it is. The next technique is something that's probably more similar to a layout or a composition technique as opposed to pure style, but the film's way of adding panels in both animated and still fashions throughout many action sequences or reactions just help it feel a lot more like a comic book. Depending on how it's integrated or layered within a scene, it can also help mimic the pace of scanning a comic book with your eyes as if you were reading it. Another pivotal technique is color separation. I won't retread old ground here as I go over it in quite a lot of detail within the color video. But for the most part, it's a real novel technique inspired by comic book printing, which has many benefits throughout this film. One last thing worth noting is the universal application of a style called graphic reduction. This creative direction helped inform a lot of the concept art, and many people within the team made a real effort to push for it in the final cut of the film. Broadly speaking, graphic reduction is the concept of removing many details of an object so they appear as their most simplistic form. By paying closer attention to the concept art and many frames of the film, you'll notice that many objects appear as simple color blobs or shapes.
When you boil them down to graphic details, it's just different shades of different colors moving, and instead of trying to simulate that, we just embraced the graphicness of that idea, because when you see it, it doesn't really change what you're experiencing, even though it's drastically simpler. Because it's so far back, we accept it as what it should be.
If you notice really closely on the bus that's crossing the scene, it's actually just a deconstructed painting. There's not 40 characters all sitting within that bus.
This creative choice means that you can do a lot more with a lot less, and objects appear to be a lot more scannable up front. It's sort of like having the complexity of a Transformers film without any of the headache. While it might seem quite obvious now, attempting to figure out what should be in 2D, what should be in 3D, what technique should you chop and change, what things should be inspired by comic books, what things should be different and novel, and making it all feel seamless is anything but easy. And even starting from an initial shot like this, which doesn't seem too bad, to go from this to the end shot of how it's shown in the film is a monumental piece of work. The Spider-Verse team had to work pretty tirelessly to innovate and figure out how all of this would work together.
It's beautiful.
So now you've got a pretty good understanding of the core building blocks within this film and what makes up its underlying base style. But that doesn't really cover all of the different flavors of it and all of the different worlds and characters that are introduced.
Trying to make the first comic book animated movie, and that's a style all of its own, but we also try to do that differently for every character from a different universe.
How a comic book is penciled, inked, colored or lettered, along with whatever technology was available at the time, along with whatever constraints they had to deal with, massively changed how a comic book looked. So even if you get a bunch of talented artists to work on one comic book title drawing mainly the same characters, you will get a series of different results, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's great for creative expression. How did Spider-Verse utilize all of it and embrace different creative expression within their film? Universe 1610. This is Miles' universe, and one that was also occupied by another version of Peter Parker. This universe has the most locations, both interior and exterior, and also differing times of day, that somewhat acts like the default style of the film.
Miles is the center of this universe that we created, so we sort of used as to establish the look of the film. All of the techniques we developed really were to make Miles look great, and what Miles looks like somewhere between a hybrid of like 90s and 80s comics.
While we could very much go through all of the different character designs and locations within the film, this universe sort of acts like the default style of the film. The only real thing that's worth mentioning within this universe is that the style is somewhat affected by placement of the story. Real life locations have a very natural feeling to them and have more of a muted colour scheme, and there's less exaggerated emphasis on a lot of the objects within a scene, whereas in superhero action scenes they are built to feel more supernatural, with more exaggerated colours, or have many objects within a scene that feel very unique. An example of this is Aunt May's house. It looks very normal on the outside and feels very natural for what you would think an old lady's house would be on the inside. But very much underneath this house is a spider layer with lots of neon aesthetics and superhero gadgets. These two locations could not be more different from each other and very much have a transitional period with the characters going to and from them. In relation to time of day, daytime shots appear to be a little bit more natural in the way that they're lit and have less exaggerated features, whereas the night shots are a bit more novel and have a soft neon theme applied to them. You also tend to get a lot more lens flare and varied colours within the city at night that you don't really get during the day, and while I couldn't quite tell, I feel like there was more half-toning and cross-hatching at night, which altogether helped make this one universe feel very novel and lived in. This universe's first appearance within the comic books was in Ultimate Spider-Man issue 1. The Ultimate Universe was one of the most longest running alternative takes on Spider-Man and many other Marvel teams. Within the final issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, Peter Parker is very much shot by taking a bullet for Captain America. With the Sinister Six on the loose, Spider-Man very much has little time to rest and very much fights to the death with the Green Goblin. Within the comic book, both of them die from an explosion, and I'm not sure if this is a reference to the fact that the version of Peter in the film from that universe dies fighting the Green Goblin in relation to an explosion. I'm not sure if that's a reference, but I thought it was a nice nod. And within both this comic book and in the film, Miles very much then follows and picks up the mantle of being Spider-Man. From a character design point of view, Miles had the most iterations for many aspects of what ended up being his final design, and he also has the most outfit changes throughout the film. While Miles' superhero costume is definitely quite similar to what it's like in the comic books, I do think his overall character design for his normal look is a bit different. Peter's design was fairly standard for what you would normally expect a Spider-Man character to look like. There was quite an interesting motif of making him the perfect version of that character, so they needed to do something to make it look slightly off. The choice of making him blonde and sort of knowing what to do in most situations is quite an interesting change, because the normal Peter just isn't really like this and is usually a bit down on his luck.
Rent?
One of my favourite character designs within this film is Kingpin, and there's also a hidden style despite the fact that it's in the same universe as Miles. Universes tend to have one art style applied to them, but this is the one case where it doesn't. Chris Miller did go on to confirm that Kingpin's design was based off the famous Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz. It looks mostly inspired from the comic book Daredevil Love and War. Within that story, Kingpin is drawn in a very large and at times grotesque manner, which is meant to highlight that he is a person who has built his empire on sin. An interpretation of the design itself attempts to make him have the appearance of a monster, and it reduces the human characteristics, mainly in the face, to further contrast him against normal people. The Spider-Verse team did a lot of great exploration around Kingpin, borrowing heavily from this style, but they ultimately did tone it down a notch and made him a bit less creepy and only very intimidating in some parts of the film.
It's not always about the money, Spider-Man.
Within the Daredevil book, there are some scenes which play heavily on lots of different brush strokes and ink patterns, and the overall frame is quite busy and grungy at times. This style is borrowed quite heavily for the Kingpin flashback sequence within the film, showing how his family dies. Parts of this style include a soft moving pattern type feel, with swirls, lines, or moving brush strokes coming off characters and objects. This soft motion effect to the characters create an overall feeling of not really knowing where an object begins and where it ends, with having a very blurred edge. Within some parts of that comic book, there's an overall watercolor and pastel effect applied to many sequences within the book, which give it a very unique style. The overall vibe that you get from looking at some panels of this book does give you the impression that this artwork could move if you look at it hard enough. And it's quite nice that in the Spider-Verse film, they very much interpreted it that way and actually animated it. Something worth noting is that within the concept art of the Spider-Verse book, this style had a lot more exaggerated ink strokes and dots, which were far more pronounced than it was in the final film. The interpretation of the style here reminds me quite a lot of the way the cutscenes worked in the Infamous games. This normal look of Kingpin's office versus how it's shown in the flashback really helped accentuate how great that style was and what it added to that scene. While we didn't get too much of this style, it's probably one of my favourites within this film. It adds a lot to very static shots, and in motion it just adds a little bit more flavour to what you're seeing on screen. Universe 8311, Spider-Ham. Normally referred to as Spider-Pig within this film, his first appearance was in Peter Porker and the Spectacular Spider-Ham. This comic book introduced many different heroes with amazing names, like Captain Americat and the legendary Goose Rider. It was originally written by Tom DeFalco, who would go on to later write Spider-Man for 2 years, introducing his black suit and co-creating many popular Spider-Man characters within the mythos, further making these characters an educated choice. The overall art style for Spider-Ham and his universe take inspiration from many famous Western cartoons. This is quite evident in many of the character design concepts for Spider-Ham and all of the different poses and exaggerated movements he has. While we don't see his universe too much within this film, it's very similar to classic Looney Tune compositions, with a slight painted feel to a lot of the backgrounds. Something that I thought was quite interesting about this style isn't purely the visual component, but how the team have played with animation principles.
And then Ham, who's my favorite alt-universe character, and his reality is sort of almost unlimited because he is a cartoon. He can like float through the air if he wants to. He can defy any law of nature he wants to, as long as it's funny. You know, he just follows the rule of any great cartoon. As long as it's funny, he can do it. And so for that reason, I wanted him to be rendered as much as I could like a 2D cartoon.
What are you? Some kind of silly cartoon?
You got a problem with cartoons?
Even in fight scenes, Spider-Pig has a lot more smears just to make the impact of things feel a lot more intense, and you'll notice that his body definitely warps to sell the impact just a bit more. If you're interested in seeing this style in a bit more detail, the team did put together a little short with Spider-Pig, which I'm pretty sure is canon as it ends with him falling into another dimension. Universe 65, Spider-Gwen. One of the breakout characters within the film. Her first appearance was in Edge of Spider-Verse issue 2, which really didn't come out that long ago, and she doesn't have the largest history. As part of the Spider-Verse event for the comic books, Gwen was introduced, and a lot of her look from that comic book translated directly to this film. I'm assuming since the Spider-Verse film was in pre-production when this comic book came out, that the character itself was already somewhat modern, hence why they look so similar. One of the key design details of Spider-Gwen's universe is the pastel watercolor effect, which is quite bright blue or pink. While mostly being a detail that most people remember and associate with Spider-Gwen, it is worth noting that within her comic book she doesn't actually have this aesthetic. The original comic book short that she was in had a very standard looking universe, although it did have a few elements to enhance the music theme to her character. The watercolor and pastel effect did come from comic books, but it weirdly came from the cover art of a follow-up series with Spider-Gwen. This style choice though very much fed its way into a lot of the concept art for her character. Something that plays more to the animation and key postures of a character is Gwen's motif as a ballet dancer. While this is sort of really lost in the sequel of the film, her character has a lot of key poses that suit one of a dancer. A lot of the character sketches show lots of these key poses and how far they went to try and make it a part of a character. While this style is ultimately improved on within the sequel as the colours map as a mood ring representing emotions of characters, the look within this film is still quite good. Her universe has really saturated colours and has pink within the sky and blue towards the ground. The universe itself appears to have a soft lens flare applied to many scenes, and it makes shots have some bright spots which just create more reflections, and when compared with a lot of the pastel colours in the background, it just makes the frame look a lot more textured. You'll notice that the objects themselves look like they were brushed and have imperfect edges. Not only is this a novel visual design approach as it makes the aesthetic look a lot more hand painted, but it also doubles up as an animation principle as it enhances smears and it just makes a few things look more impactful. Next up is Universe 90214, Spider-Man Noir. The concept of hiring Nicolas Cage, an actor known for performances like this.
Not the beast! Ah!
What are these fucking iguanas doing on my coffee table?
I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire!
And choosing to cast him as Spider-Man and giving him a gun is still something I thank the Lord for every day. Spider-Man Noir first appeared in Marvel's Noir line in 2008, along with many other characters like Daredevil, Wolverine, Punisher, and a few more. The Spider-Man Noir line of comic books were set in 1933 New York, but the universe wasn't black and white like it was in the film. His overall suit design is fairly similar to what we got in the final film. The Spider-Verse film though definitely did make the Noir character a lot more popular, and they did bring the series back for 2020, and they very much pivoted that book to have a monochromatic theme, very much like the film. The choice within Spider-Verse to make Noir's universe entirely monochromatic and without colour weirdly became a plot point within the film, which I thought was pretty funny because besides Spider-Ham, no other style is directly pointed at in this way. While you may initially think that this style was the easiest to pull off as it has the fewest amount of effects, no colour and is overall quite minimal looking, the reality is that the team had the hardest time getting this style to work out of the others within this film, as in order for a shot to look good it needed everything to have clear silhouettes, key poses to be scannable, and you can't really rely on colour and nuanced detail to visualize what's happening. This meant that the highlights and shadows on objects and characters needed to be planned out a lot more in relation to what it's normally like for the other universes. They also cleverly used the half-toning effect to create a lot more shading and detail when there isn't any. A really interesting style choice within Spider-Man Noir's universe is that he is depicted with having really large Ben-Day dots. I think this was due to the fact that comic books at that time period would have been less accurate and would have had large dots to make up colour, therefore being less effective. And when comparing Spider-Man Noir against the other Spider characters within this film, his patterns are a lot larger and more pronounced, almost to mirror the fact that he was printed on worse comic books, which I thought was quite funny. I would say that in relation to the group, Spider-Man Noir has probably the most visually different style when compared to the rest of the group, with maybe Spider-Pig coming as a close second due to how novel his animations are. Next up is Universe 14512, Penny Parker. Penny and her robot SPDR are quite the combination and weirdly have a lot of design elements to go through. Like Spider-Gwen, she was introduced fairly recently within the Edge of the Spider-Verse event and doesn't have a lot of history. Within that story, her dad dies within the suit and only Penny can pilot it due to her DNA being mapped to the suit. SPDR is more of a suit within this comic book as opposed to a standalone robot. I think this was due to the fact that the creators did say that they wanted it to be close to Evangelion. Penny is clearly based on a very traditional anime style that you would see coming out of Japan nowadays, whereas SPDR is more around the tech mech side of that. Penny's universe within the Spider-Verse film has a very strong neon theme to it and is very much set in the future. From reading the Edge of Spider-Verse event, I couldn't find any indication that Penny's universe was set in the future, but it very much does have a very advanced futuristic vibe to it. There are some very interesting designs for mechs within that comic book, so it's pretty cool. For the film, SPDR had many different design iterations and they went quite wide with their exploration, and some of them are really interesting to look at. Some of the designs are pretty creepy though, and I'm glad that the team didn't go for it and instead chose to go for something a bit more friendly. The team very much pivoted away from the mech suit vibe and went more for a standalone robot, which ultimately I think is quite novel. A lot of the character design exploration for Penny included a lot of anime emotions that made their way into the final film. There is also a really interesting power-up segment which feels very much like a Sailor Moon transformation to me, with all the colour and line work attached to it. There's some really interesting concept art before they nailed this style down, and it feels very in line with anime power-ups as a whole. Despite the fact that Japanese anime is a 2D medium and a lot of the work is done offline by hand, Penny is a full 3D model within the Spider-Verse film, with a 2D shader applied on top of her. Supposedly Penny was less work to animate in relation to some of the other characters, and I couldn't quite tell, but it appears that she's animated on 2s and 3s. You can sort of tell as her animation is a lot less smooth in relation to the other Spider team. Traditional 2D animation does have a reduced frame rate in relation to what a 3D animation would have, so I did think this was quite an interesting detail. The SPDR robot has a strong neon theme attached to it, and there's a lot of smear work to convey motion. The actual HUD within the robot is mostly in Japanese and has some pretty cool design elements to it, and it feels very much like an environment within itself. I did notice that the overall neon theme within the robot very much mimics the universe they come from themselves. And while we didn't see a lot of this in the final film, a lot of the UI was planned out in quite a lot of detail, and one of the more interesting details about the SPDR robot is that the face and display have classic style emotes that you would see in texting. This set of choices weirdly humanizes the robot and makes him feel like a character on its own just because of these reactions. And there's some pretty funny stickers applied to the robot quite subtly, which were pretty fun to notice. It is a bit of a shame that this robot gets completely slapped in the final battle and is just replaced in the next film. Next up is Universe 616. Alright, a quick note from me. According to the display, this is very much where Peter B. Parker is meant to come from, but as you'll all know, this is like the mainline universe from the comics, but it's sort of not really possible for that to be the case for a number of reasons. The same with Miles' universe as well, to be honest. My take on this is it's sort of similar to how the MCU classifies itself as the 616 universe.
And we've designated yours 616.
Don't even get me started on Doctor Strange and the little nerd back on Earth 1999.
So while you can very much create a multiverse system to try and label different types of media, if the media in question just doesn't want to label themselves correctly, there isn't really anything you can do. But either way, this version of Peter is sort of like a future version of what most people know Spider-Man to be. In terms of pure style, there isn't too much difference between this universe and Miles' universe. There is some differences subtly with colour and lighting, but as we went over that in the colour video, I won't repeat it here. Something worth noting from a character design point of view, apparently the team went through a lot of variations of how they wanted Peter B. Parker to look, especially within the Spider-Man costume. So now we've looked over some of the main characters that brought individual styles from their universes. But there were other aspects to this film that brought their own styles that weren't necessarily tied to a specific character. While I'm sure many of you are aware of the fact that the original writers and artists are attached to the comic book covers when characters are introduced, what some of you might not know is that the covers themselves were custom made for this film. Once you start comparing the initial appearance of a character in comic books, you'll start to notice some pretty obvious differences straight away. The covers within this film very much fit the design aesthetic of how they're shown and how their universes are depicted. While it's not technically as truthful as just showing the initial comic book cover from when these characters first appeared, I do think that overall this choice does make it feel a lot more cohesive from a style point of view. Speaking of custom making comic books, the rendition of the first issue of Spider-Man that Miles reads within his room is custom made for this film specifically. The introduction of Spider-Man and the iconic front cover of what he debuted on was actually a comic book line called Amazing Fantasy, and not Amazing Spider-Man issue 1. A nice little detail is that Peter is actually referred to as Billy Barker within this comic book in an effort to preserve his secret identity.
I'm a photographer.
Yes, I can see that.
At one point, the character's going to be looking at a comic book, and this comic book has to be designed. We can't have it be an actual comic book because it has to hit certain beats that we're going to hit in the film, so we have to design that.
The combination of combining Steve Ditko's origin story with John Romita's artwork is really interesting. John's style, in my opinion, is a lot more pronounced than Steve's, and his facial work and anatomy just feel a lot more expressive and superhero-y. And the fact that this comic was practically hand-drawn the traditional way in ink too is just a nice little touch.
The computer's a wonderful tool, it's absolutely marvelous, but it has a particular look to it. I just don't think it'll be the same if I tried to ink it in the computer.
The choice of adding halftones, having a specific color palette for the comic book, and removing a lot of text balloons and captions just really make this part of the film just a bit extra special. The color palette itself is very reminiscent of the limited printing techniques that they had available at the time. There are certain scenes within the film that integrate panels quite heavily. The Alchemax scene within the film starts off with panel work showing the plan of how they're going to enter it. The panels themselves vary in terms of texture, including differing line work and halftones. Some of the line work clearly doesn't map to a character, and the solid color work behind them, similar to the misprints of old comic books. And you very much get speech balloons here, which is something that the film doesn't really do for the most part. Another sequence that borrows this type of aesthetic is when Miles gets bitten by the spider. I really did like the fact that these panels are really highly saturated and have a variety of different usage of the Bend-Aid dots and halftoning. The overall aesthetic of this feels very retro and something that you would read in a Hulk comic book from the 70s. Another time that they use this comic book panel aesthetic is when Miles is in the school and running away. Something I really like about this scene is the way that the panels work with what's going on screen. Not only do they frame your eye better to Miles, but they weirdly make the scene feel a lot more three-dimensional. The panel work themselves has varied use of line art and has more of a pop art feel to it. And they also show Gwen in this in a very brief manner, which I thought was quite cool. And while it only happens for a few frames, they have actually shown how comic book panels would animate. You do notice that panels push against each other and retract, almost as if they have a logic to them. The way that some of the caption boxes work within this film is pretty fun too, and something that I liked is that in this scene of the film it actually adds to the sense of tension and some of Miles' character progression within this story. At this part he can't really control his powers, so the fact that he gets all of these caption boxes just further shows that he doesn't know what he's doing. I do like the fact that these captions almost have like a soft finale within themselves, as when his thoughts get so loud he actually starts to get speech balloons, despite the fact that they are just not needed in this film. A lot of the burst cards that you see within this film are very much in the style of the character that triggers them. Penny, for instance, has a very classic anime style card, whereas Miles has more of a graffiti paint style. And very much every character has a spin on this with differing typography, colours and texture. And finally, you got to the big one, dimension glitching. This is by far the most layered motif out of everything in the film, and it combines basically every style from before. This versatile technique can be broken down into a few different sections, and it's applied in a few different ways throughout the film. This reality-breaking style has a strong inspiration from Cubism. A founding driver for this style when it was created in real life was it was meant to be a new way of representing reality. Within many of the paintings and illustrations that use this style, things can vary in terms of how fragmented and broken something looks overall. Some artwork appears to be quite on model with more of an interesting colour or texture being applied to it, and it's quite easy to make out what it's meant to represent. Whereas in other artwork, the composition is so fragmented and abstract that it's really challenging to understand what the art is trying to depict. Within many of the concept arts for Spider-Verse with this style in mind, they went through differing iterations of how fragmented things can look. Much of this artwork is extremely exploratory, and it's really interesting to see how wide they went. It looks like they took a mirror and smashed it and applied lots of colour to many pieces of art. While it definitely looks quite cool, I'm glad they went with more of a focused version for the film itself, as it's quite easy to then focus your eye on where you're meant to look. The Spider-Verse team actively avoided the kaleidoscope style of art. This aesthetic is very known for having repeated geometry and very bright colours on top of it. While they definitely did explore it and it can be found in some of the concept art, they chose to avoid it to not be confused with Doctor Strange. Within that film, it's used to depict the mirror dimension and some of the other worlds that Doctor Strange visits, as well as being prominently shown in the end credits. And I did find it funny that both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange were co-created by Steve Ditko, who was known for mind-bending visuals. So, how did they use this style within the film? The first implication of it is a bomb that sort of ripples through its environment. This is sort of a rolling effect where it affects the scene very temporarily and only in a small region. The best part of this effect is that it shows details of another alternate universe version of that object that it affects. You'll notice that there's Penny's version of her universe, Gwen's, Noir's and Spider-Pig's. This is one of the most layered effects throughout this whole film. It probably took quite a lot of time to get this to look the way it does. It looks nice, but it's still very chaotic. When this effect is used to permanently glitch something within a universe, you do get that cubism feel to it, and it very much does look like a Banksy. Another section of this effect is the way that characters glitch specifically. A distinguishing factor of what makes cubism so novel is that you can draw a subject from many different perspectives all in one go and stitch them together with fragments. Character glitching borrows heavily from this element in order to make its look. This effect is used really well within the story, as due to how chaotic it looks and unpleasant for the characters, it brings a sense of tension and time pressure in order to get them back home. There are many creative decisions going on within this effect that make it seem somewhat painful for the characters. Showing them from different perspectives, having different elements repeated like extra hands or extra feet, and showing them in different styles from other universes just indicate that something's wrong. And the additional choice of breaking line work, actively distorting textures so they just look wrong, and applying really random color choices to what's on screen just further emphasize the fact that something is wrong here and things should be fixed. My favourite use of this in the film is when the version of Spider-Man from Miles' universe dies early on in the film. When he interacts with the collider beam, it almost looks like he's got a kaleidoscope effect that's broken all around him. It also has one of the most exaggerated use of breaking textures and applying random color work. Due to them building up to the fact that the collider is about to explode, they intensify the style a lot, and you don't really see this in most parts of the film. The creative decision of dialing this effect's intensity up and down, depending on what's happening in the story, was a really great one. In a scene where there's a focus on exposition and dialogue, the glitching is nowhere near as intense. There's less colors, there's less character reactions, and there's overall less things going on. Whereas in a scene where they want to emphasize the fact that people are glitching and it's a bad thing, they jack up the saturation of the scene, textures break a lot more, the animation speed is also much faster, and there's very much more broken proportions.
And obviously you've been glitching.
Glitching? No. Why would you even say that?
The next part of this is something that I'm going to call Kirby portals. If you use the words Marvel and portals within one sentence, you're likely thinking of a very specific scene, or at least a visual effect that has its own look. The team chose to have their own unique portal design for this film. The key distinction is that the Spider-Verse portals use Kirby dots in differing sizes and layer lots of different types of effects over it. These Kirby dots are very much animated to almost create like a mini vortex that creates the portal, which I thought was pretty cool. These portal scenes have very unique lighting, saturated colours and some novel line work that all together just make this scene feel very supernatural. And there is also some soft universe glitching within the background, which I thought was quite cool, as it just brings the fact that the characters glitch if they're not in the right universe a bit full circle. The scene of Peter being sucked into the portal is a pretty good one. His whole apartment seems to be affected by zero gravity. There's lots of colour separation and inconsistent colour work compared to normal. There's also unique textures that don't appear anywhere in the film, and just overall you get a sense of chaos. Next up is the multiverse itself. It's shown within the portals as a view, and I'm going to refer to it as the Web of Destiny because it looks very similar to that in the comic books. A nice inclusion is that within the collider sequences, despite the fact that the frame is very busy and there's a lot going on, they did tease the Spider-Man that would appear later on in the film very briefly, and I just thought that was really cool. All of the innovation regarding style within this film was created by changing lots of different techniques to create new effects. So even though they've covered so much ground and created lots of different visual aesthetics, there is one scene within the film that somehow combines all of this. The final fight between Miles and Kingpin combines all these different styles and plays with nearly all of the techniques within them. There's a train sequence within this fight where Miles and Kingpin are fighting each other within one carriage as the collider is firing in the background. This one segment had items that needed to be modelled and designed in different universe styles just for this scene to work. Penny's universe, for instance, had a train that was all neon and didn't have any seats. The carriage in Gwen's universe is very pastel-y and you can barely make out any of the details. Spider-Man Noir's universe, for instance, has a carriage that feels like a very old school train, and not only have they changed the interior of this train, but they've also changed the exterior to make sure that it maps to what's going on within the story. All of this while having unique line work and playing with many of the techniques spoken about before makes this one segment extremely interesting. The only other thing within this film that's pretty interesting is actually the end credit sequence. This style is very kaleidoscopic from what I can see, and the design is pretty interesting. I would also say they've taken influence from stop motion here, as they've laid out a lot of key frames that makes a pattern within itself. And there was very much one more style that ultimately didn't make it into the final film, but I thought it was pretty cool. The scene within the film of Miles and Aaron talking, which ultimately leads into the shoulder touch conversation. Earlier on within the script they were playing a video game together, and it's quite interesting because they were playing a Spider-Man video game. I suspect that this was meant to be an homage to Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and was done within that style. The characters are very much made up of sprites, which is what that game did, and Spider-Man even has the exact same pose. I'm not going to talk about Miguel's world because it looks fairly standard, and I know that he goes into the old Spider-Man cartoon from the 60s, but it's not a spin on that style, it's just that style played out. So with that, we have now concluded all the styles that I could find within this one film. While it may seem all well and good now, the fact that a team were able to get the space and permission to explore like this is incredibly rare. While Hollywood tends to be an entity that greenlights things based on safety, brand recognition, and target audience size, In order to make such a leap forward within the animation space like this team did, they probably needed time to explore, refine, and create new technologies, including figuring out how everyone would work together in order to achieve something that likely took a lot of time and money. With how Hollywood tends to treat creative and animation departments, I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be the one asking for more time, permission to break convention, formulate new ways of working, and not hit the production line immediately.
We need to take the whole line back to formula. Back to formula.
But I guess we're in the timeline where they took a chance and chose to embrace style instead.